Imagine a sound capable of instantly freezing the blood in the veins of hundreds of war-hardened men. A sound that has nothing to do with the familiar roar of artillery or the whistle of bullets, but resembles the dull, wet thud of a sack of wet cement dropped from a roof onto dry, scorching earth. The calendar says July 1967, and we are in the very heart of the U.S. military machine, at the Camp Pendleton Marine Corps base, where the air is heated to 40 degrees and dust clogs the pores, mixing with the smell of gun oil and aggressive male sweat. In the center of the trampled parade ground, surrounded by a dense ring of soldiers, stands a man whose presence here seems like a mockery of the regulations. It is Bruce Lee. But for these guys, who will ship out to Vietnam tomorrow, he is not a legend and not a philosopher. He is a Hollywood clown, a Chinese dancer in fancy glasses who came to teach them, professional killers, how to fight. The tension on the parade ground is so thick you could cut it with a bayonet, and the epicenter of this tension is not Bruce, but the man standing opposite him, Sergeant Jones, a hand-to-hand combat instructor, a living mountain of muscle with a scar across his entire cheek, who looks at the little dragon like food. You probably think this will be a demonstration performance, a friendly sparring match to boost morale. That is the lie the command believed when inviting the actor. But the reality unfolding under the scorching California sun instantly turned into a personal vendetta. Sergeant Jones did not intend to train. He intended to publicly destroy the myth. He took a step forward, violating Bruce's personal space, and his shadow covered Lee completely. "There are no rules in war, son," he growled, and his voice, accustomed to shouting over explosions, rang out over the parade ground like a verdict. "Your pretty stances and jumps are good for girls in the cinema. But here, in reality, I will simply break your neck while you are portraying a crane, and no director will yell 'cut.'" The crowd of Marines exploded with an approving hum. They yearned to see how their commander would smear this upstart, how rough, trench power would break fragile Eastern aesthetics. But to understand the surreal nature of what happens next, you need to look away from the sergeant's face, twisted with malice, and look at Bruce Lee's left hand. There, clenched in his fist, is our plot dagger, an object that seems absolutely useless in a fight, but which in a minute will become a symbol of total superiority. It is a dense black fabric blindfold. Why does he have it? Bruce took it out of his pocket the moment the sergeant began his insults. Do you think he wants to wipe his sweat with it? Or perhaps surrender by throwing out a white, in this case, black, flag? The sergeant thought so too. He smirked, seeing the rag in his opponent's hands, deciding that Bruce was already preparing an excuse for his defeat. But here, the very Santa Barbara effect comes into force, causing your brain to stall from surprise. Bruce Lee did not make excuses. He did not take a fighting stance. He did something that contradicts the self-preservation instinct of any living being on the planet. Bruce slowly, with frightening calm, took off his shirt, remaining in just a tank top, and turned his back to the sergeant. The crowd gasped. To turn your back on an enemy who promised to break your neck? This is suicide. This is madness. But Bruce didn't just turn away. He raised his hands to his head and began to tie that very black blindfold over his eyes. Sergeant Jones froze. The smirk slid off his face, replaced by an expression of deep misunderstanding. He expected fear. He expected resistance. But he did not expect the victim to blindfold himself before the execution. "Attack when you want, Sergeant." Bruce's voice sounded quiet, but in the absolute silence of the parade ground, every word was like the crack of a whip. "You have the advantage. You can see me. You are bigger than me. You are stronger than me. I will even the odds. I won't look." Ask yourself honestly, what would you feel in the sergeant's place? This was no longer just an insult. This was humiliation of the highest order. Bruce Lee was telling him, "You are so insignificant as a fighter that I don't need eyes to defeat you." Jones's rage, fueled by this gesture of disdain, reached a boiling point. He saw this as a chance not just to win, but to punish. He decided that this blind Chinese man had made the last mistake of his life. The sergeant clenched his fists, his muscles tensed like steel cables, and he prepared for a dash that was supposed to take Bruce Lee's head off his shoulders. The air over the parade ground vibrated with tension. The soldiers held their breath, realizing that a murder was about to happen, but none of them, including the sergeant himself, guessed that Bruce Lee had blindfolded himself not to make the task harder, but to see what is inaccessible to ordinary vision, the opponent's intention, even before it turns into movement. To fully feel that electric charge of madness that gripped the Camp Pendleton parade ground, you need to momentarily climb into Sergeant Jones's head and see the world through his eyes, because without this context, you will see only a strange trick, but miss the very essence of the deadly trap into which Bruce Lee voluntarily stepped. For Jones, a man who had gone through the hell of jungles and hand-to-hand combat, where the price of a mistake is a zinc coffin, this gesture with the blindfold was not just a challenge. It was a spit in the face of everything he believed in. He looked at the back of the small man in the black blindfold and felt his blood boiling, turning into liquid fire, because in his concept of honor, an enemy must look you in the eye when you kill him. The sergeant perceived this as a game, as a cheap magic trick designed to humiliate him in front of his own soldiers, and his brain, honed for destruction, produced the only possible reaction. If this clown doesn't want to look, then he won't see how he dies. Jones began to clench and unclench his huge fists, and the crunch of his joints in this vacuum silence sounded louder than the clanking of tank tracks. Ask yourself honestly, what would you feel standing in the crowd and watching an unarmed blind man turn his back to an enraged bear? The soldiers surrounding them in a tight ring stopped smirking. Their amusement evaporated, giving way to sticky, cold fear, because they realized this is no longer a show. Sergeant Jones did not intend to play sparring. He intended to break this insolent man's spine. The air over the parade ground became so thick with tension that it seemed as if gravity had doubled, pressing the spectators to the ground. All eyes were fixed on our dagger, on that very black blindfold that tightly covered Bruce Lee's eyes, depriving him of any fighter's main tool, vision. Do you think Bruce was bluffing? That he was peeking through a slit in the fabric? That is the saving thought your rational brain clings to, but the reality was much scarier. The blindfold was real, dense, impenetrable. Bruce Lee voluntarily plunged himself into darkness, remaining alone with a monster he could not see, but whom he had to feel with his skin. And here the very conveyor belt principle comes into force, causing your heart to beat in your throat. Bruce didn't just stand there, he listened, but he didn't listen with his ears. He turned his whole body into a giant radar. He felt the vibration of the dry soil under his feet. He sensed how the currents of hot wind changed when the sergeant took a breath. He read the intent to kill even before it turned into a muscle contraction. It wasn't mysticism. It was physics on the verge of the supernatural, but to Jones, it looked like the submissiveness of a victim. The sergeant took a step. Gravel crunched under his heavy army boot. This sound was the signal for the beginning of the end. Jones didn't intend to use technique. He intended to use mass. He decided he would simply get a running start and smash into Bruce like a freight train, smashing into a car stuck on the tracks, breaking bones and trampling him into the dust. The viewer at this moment expects Bruce to tense up, take a low stance, prepare for the impact. But here the Santa Barbara effect triggers, turning everything upside down and causing cognitive shock. Bruce Lee did not tense up. He relaxed even more. His shoulders dropped. His arms hung along his body like whips. He began to look like a rag doll suspended on invisible strings. This contradicted all survival instincts. Why is he doing this? Did he decide to die? Sergeant Jones, seeing this relaxation, let out a triumphant roar. He was sure that fear had paralyzed the Chinese dancer. He broke into a run. 100 kilograms of muscle and fury rushed forward, gaining speed with every step. The ground beneath their feet trembled. The soldiers squeezed their eyes shut, expecting the sound of a breaking body. Jones flew at Bruce, arms outstretched to grab, break, destroy. The distance closed. 5 meters. 3, 2. In this second, time stretched into infinity. Bruce Lee stood with his back to the approaching death, blind, motionless, and it seemed that nothing in the world could save him from this collision. But none of those present knew that in this darkness, behind the black blindfold, Bruce saw everything much more clearly than they did with their open eyes, and that he was waiting for this exact moment, the moment when the enemy's inertia would become his own weapon, and blindness would turn into the highest form of vision. In that very fraction of a second, when 100 kilograms of living, pulsating rage, packed into a military uniform, broke loose, turning the parade ground into a zone of seismic activity, time at Camp Pendleton didn't just slow down. It collapsed into a single ringing, vacuum point of no return. The thunder of Sergeant Jones's army boots on the dry, cracked earth resembled the approach of an avalanche, and every strike of his foot on the ground sent a vibration felt by the souls of all hundred spectators frozen in stupor. You probably think that, at this moment, Bruce Lee should have tensed up, grouped himself, prepared for the inevitable collision with the locomotive. That would be logical. That would be dictated by the self-preservation instinct of any creature a predator is rushing towards. But here, in the epicenter of this dusty hell, comes that very visual silence that makes your ears pop and your vision go dark. Bruce Lee did not move a muscle. He continued to stand with his back to the approaching death, his arms hanging like whips, and the black blindfold on his eyes, our plot dagger, remained motionless, like a blindfold on the face of a man sentenced to execution by firing squad. Ask yourself, what goes on in the head of a person who hears a killer approaching, but does not see him? Jones was already 3 meters away. 2. He had already raised his huge hook hands to grab Bruce by the neck and break it with one jerk, like a dry branch. The sergeant already felt the taste of victory on his lips. He saw the defenseless back. He heard his own heavy breathing, which drowned out all the sounds of the world. He was sure that the actor was paralyzed by fear, that this trick with the blindfold had become a trap for Bruce himself. But Jones didn't know that in this darkness, cut off from visual noise, Bruce Lee saw him much more clearly than if he were looking point blank. Deprived of sight, Bruce switched on another mechanism of perception, the very one ancient masters called listening to the skin. He felt the disturbance of the air pushed by the running giant. He sensed the heat of his rage. He heard the rhythm of his steps, and knew exactly in which fraction of a second the sergeant's foot would leave the ground for the final lunge. And then this moment arrived. Jones, letting out a guttural roar, jumped. His fingers were centimeters from Bruce's neck. The spectators, unable to watch the execution, averted their eyes. But here, the Santa Barbara effect worked, causing your brain to explode from the impossibility of what was happening. Bruce Lee did not run away. He did not block. He simply disappeared. At the moment when the sergeant's inertia reached its peak, Bruce made a movement that seemed like a violation of the laws of physics. He didn't take a step. He flowed. He shifted his center of gravity to the left and down, simultaneously extending his right leg back, into the dead zone of the opponent's step. It wasn't karate. It wasn't judo. It was pure geometry of chaos. The sergeant's hands, which were supposed to close on the victim's throat, grabbed emptiness with a loud clap. The air he tried to tear remained unharmed, but inertia is a cruel mistress. 100 kilograms of weight, accelerated to the limit, cannot stop instantly. Jones, having lost the target his brain already considered captured, suddenly discovered that he was no longer running, he was flying. Bruce Lee, still standing with his back turned and not seeing the opponent, used a microscopic touch of his foot against the sergeant's ankle to turn his horizontal run into an uncontrolled fall. It was an intellectual orgasm of biomechanics. Bruce didn't hit him. He simply allowed the sergeant to trip over his own aggression. Are you waiting for the sound of a blow? Are you waiting for Bruce to finish him off? No. The scariest thing was the silence of this flight. Sergeant Jones, this invincible warrior, flew past Bruce like a trash bag thrown from a train window. He flailed his arms, trying to grab onto the air, his eyes full of that very childish, animal misunderstanding that arises when the ground disappears from under your feet. And Bruce? Bruce remained standing in the same spot. He didn't even turn around. His chest rose and fell in a calm rhythm, and the black blindfold on his eyes didn't shift a single millimeter. He stood like a rock against which a wave had crashed, and in this static pose, there was more power than in the entire U.S. nuclear arsenal. He proved that vision is a crutch for those who do not know how to feel. But what will happen when this living torpedo named Jones meets the ground? And why did Bruce suddenly slowly raise his hand, like a conductor stopping an orchestra, a second before the sergeant's body touched the ground? The answer to this question lies in the plane where the fight ends and philosophy begins. But this lesson will cost the sergeant not only a broken nose, but also a broken worldview. The sound with which Sergeant Jones's body met the hard earth of the parade ground, compacted by thousands of boots, was like the impact of a meteorite, a dull, heavy, visceral thud that sent a cloud of yellow dust into the air, instantly hiding the fallen giant from the eyes of the stunned crowd. It was a moment of total physical and moral annihilation. 100 kilograms of elite muscle, accelerated by its own rage, slammed into the planet with such force that it seemed the fillings should have flown out of the sergeant's teeth. For a second, that ringing, dead silence reigned on the parade ground, which can only be heard after an explosion, when the shell-shocked world tries to remember what life sounds like. The soldiers standing in the front row instinctively recoiled, covering their faces with their hands from the dust, but their eyes were wide open with horror and disbelief. They saw the run-up, they saw the jump, but they didn't see a hit. A cognitive glitch occurred in their consciousness. How can a man lose a fight if his opponent didn't even turn his face to him? Jones lay in the center of the dust cloud, arms spread like a broken doll, his chest heaving convulsively, trying to suck air into knocked-out lungs, and in his head, ringing from the impact, the same thought spun around. Did a truck hit me? Where did a truck come from? But when the dust began to slowly settle, revealing the picture of destruction, the gazes of all present were drawn like a magnet, not to the lying sergeant, but to the figure towering over him, maintaining absolute, almost sculptural stillness. Bruce Lee stood exactly where he had been. He wasn't out of breath. His tank top wasn't askew. Slowly, with the grace of a surgeon who has finished a most complex operation, he raised his hands to the back of his head. You expect him to rip off the blindfold and raise his fist in victory? That would be cheap theater. Bruce acted differently. He calmly untied the knot. The fabric, our plot dagger, that very black blindfold, soaked in the sweat of his forehead, slid into his palm. Bruce opened his eyes. There was no triumph of a winner in them, no gloating. In them was the calm, cool clarity of a man who had just proved a theorem that no one doubted except fools. He looked at the fabric in his hand, neatly folded it, and put it in his pocket as if it were an ordinary handkerchief, and not the tool with which he had just humiliated the base's best fighter. And this is where the moment of intellectual orgasm arrives, causing your brain to explode from realization. Bruce Lee won, not because he was faster or stronger. He won because he was absent. Sergeant Jones didn't lose to Bruce Lee. He lost to the void that Bruce created in the right place at the right time. The greatest lesson of this fight was that aggression meeting no resistance destroys itself. Jones, lying in the dirt, was living proof that strength without eyes is weakness, and vision without understanding is blindness. The sergeant, groaning and spitting out sand, tried to prop himself up on his elbows. His face, smeared with gray dust, expressed a mixture of pain and that childish, naive misunderstanding that a person has when encountering magic for the first time. He looked up at Bruce from below, expecting mockery, expecting a final kick that would finally trample him into the ground. After all, that is exactly what he would have done himself. In his world, the winner takes all, and the loser pays with blood. But Bruce Lee took a step forward. The crowd gasped, expecting an execution. However, instead of a blow, Bruce extended a hand, an open palm. He leaned toward the sergeant, and in this movement, there was not a drop of arrogance, only a calm offer of help. Ask yourself honestly, could you offer a hand to a man who a minute ago wanted to break your spine? This requires a strength of spirit that exceeds any physical power. Jones froze. He looked at this hand like a hallucination. His brain, accustomed to cruelty, refused to believe that he wouldn't be finished off. But Bruce smiled, that very soft, disarming smile that made him look not like a killer, but like a philosopher. "Water takes any form, Sergeant," he said quietly, but in the vacuum silence of the parade ground, his voice sounded like thunder. "It can flow, or it can destroy. Today it took the form of your face in the mud because you tried to smash it with a stone. But water holds no malice. Stand up." These words hit Jones harder than the fall. He realized he had lost twice, first physically, and now morally. He, a combat officer, turned out to be lesser in spirit than this actor. With a trembling hand, scraped bloody against the gravel, the sergeant grasped Bruce's palm. A jerk, and Bruce, demonstrating frightening strength for his weight, pulled the giant to his feet. Jones stood, swaying, brushing off his uniform, and dared not raise his eyes. He was crushed, but at the same time, he was saved. He realized that Bruce Lee had given him his life by not letting inertia break his neck during the fall. For that very wave of Bruce's hand at the last moment, which no one understood, actually slightly corrected the trajectory of the sergeant's fall, saving him from paralysis. It was a discovery that took Jones's breath away. He had fought an angel of death who decided to show mercy. And while the soldiers around began to come to their senses, realizing they had just seen a miracle, Bruce Lee had already turned away, looking for his shirt, showing with his whole appearance that the lesson was over and the bell had already rung. When Bruce Lee, with a casual, almost everyday movement, threw his simple cotton shirt over his shoulders, hiding beneath it a body that had just demonstrated superiority over the laws of physics, a transformation occurred on the Camp Pendleton parade ground that could be compared to a religious conversion. 100 Marines, the elite of the U.S. Army, men taught to kill without hesitation and respect only brute force, stood silently, and in their eyes, fixed on the receding figure in black sunglasses, there was no longer mockery. There was fear mixed with awe. You probably think that Sergeant Jones, having dusted himself off, harbored a grudge and began planning revenge, as villains do in cheap action movies. That would be a logical reaction for a man with a bruised ego, but the reality of that hot day turned out to be much more complex and profound. Jones stood looking at his palms, covered in gray dust, and in his head that very intellectual orgasm of realization was happening, which changes destinies. He understood that today, on this parade ground, Bruce Lee didn't just beat him in a fight, he possibly saved his life in the future war. The sergeant realized that his rigidity, his straightforward aggression, his belief that mass cannot be stopped, all this was a one-way ticket in the Vietnamese jungles, where the enemy, like Bruce, would not play by the rules, but would use the terrain, cunning, and emptiness. Remember our plot dagger, that very black blindfold that now rested in Bruce's pocket. For the soldiers, it ceased to be a magician's prop. It became a symbol of high pilotage, proof that true vision does not depend on eyes, and true control does not depend on muscle strength. The soldiers understood that Bruce had blindfolded himself not to humiliate their commander, but to show them the limit of human capabilities, the level they must strive for if they want to return home alive. It was a lesson not on how to hit, but on how to feel. Jones, still breathing heavily, took a step forward, but not to attack. He stood at attention and saluted the departing master. It was a gesture not written in the regulations, to salute a civilian, and an actor at that, but in that moment it was the only possible action. And one by one, 100 soldiers on the parade ground repeated this gesture, seeing Bruce Lee off in a silence that thundered louder than an artillery volley. But this story leaves us with a question that sits like a splinter in the brain and demands an answer, because it touches on the very essence of risk and responsibility. We admire the result, we applaud the winner, but let's look at the situation soberly, without fan love. Bruce Lee, a father of two, a rising star, a man who bore the responsibility for popularizing an entire culture, voluntarily deprived himself of sight and stood with his back to a killing machine weighing 100 kilograms. One wrong move, one error in calculation, one stone under his foot, and Sergeant Jones would have broken his spine, turning a legend into an invalid even before the release of Enter the Dragon. Did he have the right to risk like that? Was this act supreme pedagogy, a necessary lesson that could only be taught through shock therapy, proving to skeptics that spirit is stronger than matter? Or was it a manifestation of monstrous pride, bordering on madness, where the master's ego demands not just victory, but impossible triumph, even if his own life and his family's future are at stake? Whose side are you on in this final dispute? Do you see Bruce as a teacher who is ready to die for the truth, or a gambler who simply cannot stop, raising the stakes to the point of absurdity? Write one word in the comments, teacher or gambler. I will wait for your verdict, because in this answer lies the solution to who Bruce Lee really was, an enlightened sage who knew Zen, or an adrenaline junkie who danced with death every time just to feel alive. And did you notice that in the end, he didn't even turn around? Write if you consider this coolness or arrogance,